Okay, let's make a start. Welcome everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm director of the Policy Institute at King's College London and chair of the Campaign for Social Science, which is part of the Academy of Social Sciences. And this is our key event of the year, the Campaign for Social Science SAGE annual lecture. For those of you who don't know, the campaign's role is to demonstrate how social science improves public policy, society, and all our lives. It highlights the value of applied social science research and then advocates for its greater use in decision-making and government. And it's supported by 35 different universities, and its main sponsor is the publishers SAGE, who sponsor this lecture and have also been brilliant partners over many years for the campaign. So as I said, this is the flagship event of the campaign's annual calendar, and it couldn't be more topical and important. It comes just after the US election and at the end of a year of dozens of elections around the world, including, of course, our own. And we have absolutely ideal person to guide us through this in Dr. Hannah White, who's Director and CEO of the Institute for Government. And Hannah's distinguished careers helped government in all sorts of ways to work better, including as Secretary to the Committee on Standards in Public Life in the Cabinet Office and in a number of roles at IFG, among many others. And I guess a key thing for Hannah's career and approach is that communicating that to a wide audience is a key skill and focus for her. So engagement in the media, podcasts and books, and that's very dear to the heart of the campaign and our purpose. So Hannah's going to discuss what the future might hold for the UK and its new government within this really shifting global political landscape, how the UK finds its place and plays its part in those sorts of global challenges, as well as managing problems at home, challenges and opportunities at home, such as those around housing, health, education, the economy, tackling inequalities, and empowering the UK's devolved nations and regions. And when I saw that list, I said, gosh, Hannah, that's great. We're going to sort all of that out in this session. So a big agenda for Hannah today. The lecture also follows on from the campaign's Election 24 project, which ran from September 2023 through to the announcement of the UK general election. We did think we'd gone a bit early, starting in September 2023. We were thinking at some points we're going to have to change this to Election 25, because there was discussion about pushing the election back as far as you could to January 25. But it was a wise move in hindsight to go early, because we got loads of great material, published pieces, written pieces from people, as well as numerous events. And so you can find all the content still on the website, but you can also take away a copy of this report, Beyond the Ballot, Social Insights on 8 Key Policy Challenges, which is hot off the press. It was only launched last week, so we hope you enjoy it and take some value from that. So in terms of running order, tonight, very straightforward. In a moment, I'll hand over to Katie Metzler from SAGE for a word from SAGE's perspective. Then Hannah will deliver her lecture for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end of that for some Q&A and discussion. So do think of your questions while Hannah is talking. Then we've got a reception after that, drinks afterwards through that door, I think. Steve will go out that way, lovely reception out there. So let's get on with the evening and hand over to Katie Metzler. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you, Bobby. Hello, welcome everyone. My name's Katie Metzler. I'm a VP at SAGE. So welcome everyone to this year's annual lecture. In case you don't know SAGE, we're an independent academic publisher, and our mission is to build bridges to knowledge. Next year, SAGE will turn 60. And since our very first journal in urban studies, published 60 years ago, we have proudly supported the development of the social sciences. We've also been independent since day one, and our independence is guaranteed thanks to our founder, Sarah Miller McCune. She actually started SAGE when she was just 24 years old, and she recently passed control of the company to an independent trust, which is charged with maintaining our independence and mission for the long term. So what this means in practice is that a selection of universities and charitable organizations will become SAGE's beneficial owners. And by transferring control of SAGE into trust, Sarah has secured our independence. And that means that we're free to make long-term decisions, to take risks, and to make investments that advance our mission and our academic goals for the next 60 years and beyond. And one of the ways that we support the social sciences is through events like this one, which are free and open to everyone, and that highlight the role of social science in helping us to understand and address the most urgent issues facing society. In 2022, our lecture was focused on the causes and the impacts of the UK's cost of living crisis, and that was delivered by Torsten Bell from the Resolution Foundation, now MP for Swansea West. And last year, Professor Gary Young delivered a really inspirational lecture on political realism in the UK as we headed to the polls. And as Bobby mentioned, the lecture is part of a series of events, publications, and activities that the campaign, with the support from SAGE, has run throughout the year on elections. So please do go and check out the campaign's website, where you can find some of the excellent content that we produced. And please do also take away your copy of Beyond the Ballot, which we're very proud to have published. So through SAGE's publishing, which you can check out in the reception afterwards, we have a stall, we have free books, so stay for the free books, and also through our social science podcast series, and through our support of partner organizations like the Campaign for Social Sciences, we do our best to highlight the hugely important role that academics play in helping to maintain a healthy society, especially in election years. We really need social scientists to examine election processes, to analyze policy proposals, to investigate the impacts of political rhetoric on society, among many other things. We need academics who are free to research, evaluate, and critique the impact of government's actions or inactions without fear of reprisals, and this has never felt so important. We need academics who can disagree with one another while also defending their opponent's right to be heard. Academic freedom and freedom of expression are not static victories. They are dynamic principles that require constant vigilance and defense to maintain. These freedoms are never fully secured, they're always evolving, and they're perpetually challenged and often under direct attack. So it's our collective responsibility to safeguard these freedoms. And SAGE is very proud to be the publisher of the Index on Censorship, which is a magazine devoted to free expression. And also to publish the work of so many social scientists who are holding governments to account all around the world. So thank you, everyone who supports the campaign. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for supporting the work and the importance of the social sciences and their importance in evidence and policy making. And thank you to our speaker. And with that, I'll pass over to Dr. Hannah White to deliver tonight's lecture on what the future might hold for the UK and its new government within a changing political landscape. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so impressed you're all here tonight with the rain. I think I'm taking it as a big endorsement. Thank you. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Bobby, for the invitation to give the lecture. Thanks to SAGE for supporting the annual lecture. So as a lapsed academic human geographer, I'm a really passionate advocate for the value of the social sciences in improving government, public policy and society. And I'm really proud that the Institute for Government, which I lead, has long-standing relationships with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Economic and Social Research Council, and indeed UKRI, lots of other organisations like UPenn, the University's Public Policy Engagement Network, lots of people who are working to help channel academic research into public policy and into government at all levels. We also work directly with ministers, with MPs and civil servants to help them understand the value of academic research and all sorts of academic evidence and how to use it in their roles. And there's some people in the audience who help us do that, so thank you again to you. You know who you are. I've also long been an admirer of the Campaign for Social Sciences and the valuable work that it does, so I was really very flattered to be invited to give this lecture tonight. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to start, just as a bit of a reminder for you all, with a quick run through some of the key elections that have taken place around the world this year and make a few observations about what I think are some of the key themes that they illustrate. And then I'm going to go on to discuss what I think is one of the most interesting and important questions arising from this year of elections that we have had, as Bobby was saying. And that question is, what's the relationship between governments delivering for their people and the trust of those people in democracy? And I think this is a really important question, both in the short term for governments thinking about what they need to do to meet the expectations of their voters, but also for anyone interested in the future of democracy. And I think although the answer might seem simple, in fact, I don't really think that it is. And I'm going to talk about some of the lessons we might take from this year's elections to think about the answer to that question. So starting with our year of elections, 2024 has been a very significant year, as you'll all know, for democracy and for the global political landscape, with elections held in more than 70 countries and among nearly half the world's population. Of course, here in the UK, we spent the first half of the year obsessing about the date of the election. And I think that was probably a major productivity hit to most of the people who work in and around Westminster, and that's a argument, if you need one, for fixed-term parliaments. The second half of the year, we've spent analysing the outcome of July's surprise election, the first Labour government entering power for 14 years, and with a significant parliamentary majority. And then, of course, more recently, President Trump's dramatic return to the world stage is already having repercussions across the globe, and will no doubt continue to do so for the next 4 years at least. But these haven't been the only significant elections that we've seen in the world this year. In January, at the start of the year, Taiwan elected Lai Ching-te as its next president, ushering in a historic third term in power for the pro-sovereignty Democratic Progressive Party and angering Beijing. In geopolitical terms, the position of Taiwan continues to be a potential flashpoint, with Trump's election introducing further uncertainty and risk into the relationships between major global powers. And I think that is one of the key themes which emerges from this year of elections, that greater uncertainty and these relationships between global powers, China, the US, and so on. Then in March, Vladimir Putin claimed a landslide victory and a fifth term in presidential elections that were widely condemned as neither free or fair by the West. This, unfortunately, has been another theme of the elections that have taken place this year. Not all democracies are equally free and fair. 26 of the 70 elections that happened this year, so more than a third, were in countries which the Economist Intelligence Unit classifies as authoritarian, or where significant electoral fraud happens regularly, preventing them being classed as fully democratic. In Rwanda, for example, long-standing President Paul Kagame apparently won 99% of the vote. And even among the remaining two-thirds of countries which have held elections this year, many, including the US and India, are nations where, although elections are free, fair, and basic civil liberties are honoured, the EIU has identified issues such as media freedom infringement and minor suppression of political opposition and critics. Going back to Russia, the government said that Putin won 87% of the vote and that turnout was the highest in history at 74% of the electorate. These are sorts of results that previously used to appear only in Russia's most despotic regions, such as Chechnya. Of course, there was no meaningful opposition to Putin. Just a month before the election, the country's most prominent opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, died in mysterious circumstances in prison in Siberia. March was also significant for an election that didn't happen, an example of the way in which major conflict can inhibit the exercise of democracy. Ukraine was due a presidential election in March because Volodymyr Zelensky's 5-year term had come to an end. But under martial law, elections were suspended. Zelensky remains in power, grappling with the implications of changes of government in the US, but also in the EU. The world's largest election, with nearly 1 billion registered voters, took place in India between April and June. That election was notable because of Narendra Modi's surprise drop in support. He secured a third term, but only by forming a coalition with 2 other parties for the first time. Analysis from Chatham House suggests that while the BJP had campaigned on the twin themes of India's rising global status and its traditional Hindu nationalist credentials that the BJP is known for, in more cosmopolitan and secular areas and in parts of the country with strong regional identities, local livelihood issues were more significant for voters. As we subsequently saw in the US, high levels of inequality in India meant that narratives about the benefits of globalization and the success of the national economy fell flat, with voters not feeling the benefits in their own pockets. Later in June, we saw the 10th set of European parliamentary elections. Populist radical right parties performed well, including Marine Le Pen's National Rally, which topped the polls in France, prompting President Emmanuel Macron to call an election designed to clarify the parliamentary situation. The result, however, driven by a leftist pact which successfully squeezed out the far right, really succeeded only in muddying the situation further. The real winners in the European Parliament were the centre-right European People's Party, with the losers on the centre-left and the Greens, and the result has created a more fragmented and polarised EP. This fragmentation of opposition was a fascinating, although less reported, aspect of the UK election, which took place unexpectedly in July. Alongside the expected large Labour majority, we saw unprecedentedly effective tactical voting in constituencies across the country, with voters accurately selecting the candidates most likely to beat the incumbent Conservatives. That and a very successful tactical campaign resulted in the Liberal Democrats securing 72 seats, their most proportional result ever under the UK's first-past-the-post system. But also an unusually diverse opposition, with 6 minority parties securing 4 or more MPs. So Plaid and the Greens now have 4, Reform and the DUP have 5, Sinn Féin has 7, and the SNP has 9. We also saw an unusually large number of independents elected, 6, and all these parties were successful at the time that the number of Conservative MPs fell to a low of just 121. So a very interestingly diverse and fragmented opposition now in the UK Parliament. Of the remaining elections that have taken place in this year of elections, the one of the most global significance, of course, was that in the US. The results are still being analysed as the reality show of Trump setting up his new administration is starting to play out across X, Truth Social, and Fox News. Meanwhile, across the world, governments are assessing the implications of Trump's return for their relationship with the US, for their wider international relations, and for their own electoral strategies. On the one hand, conducting this assessment isn't too hard to do. As former US Ambassador Kim Darroch told us on the IFG podcast, Inside Briefing, last week, one of Trump's assets is the complete transparency of his thinking. He wakes up and he immediately tells the world what he's thinking on social media. Of course, the downside is his unpredictability. He's also perfectly capable of changing his mind on a sixpence. There's some research which indicates that such instability in a leader can have a stabilizing effect on international relations. If you can't predict how your opponent will react, you're less likely to take a risk. Trump claims this is why Putin didn't invade Ukraine during his presidency. But an unpredictable US leader is not easy for the traditional modes of multilateral diplomacy, the games of 3D chess that typically rely on careful calibration and bargaining. Of course, Trump's nationalist politics has little time for multilateralism, which is a matter of concern to NATO, the UN, and other international institutions. So that's your little summary and reminder of the elections this year, some of the key elections. But zooming out from the specifics of what those elections have delivered, I think, as I said, that one of the most interesting questions they raise, and the one I want to delve into for the remainder of this lecture and hopefully discuss with you all in the Q&A that follows, is what is the relationship between governments delivering for their people and the trust of those people in democracy? Now, I'm sure you can see why I, as someone who runs an institute focused on effective government, who came to the IFG after a career in Parliament, thinks that this is an interesting question. But I do think that the relationship between government delivery and trust in democracy is an issue that ought to concern us all. So what is the proposition that I want to test? Broadly, that if voters' confidence in democracy and choices in elections are driven at whatever level by evidence of government delivering for the public, then there's an electoral incentive for politicians to focus on delivery and hence to work to improve the effectiveness of the state. But if that relationship is loosening, if voters are rewarding factors other than delivery, or are making decisions based on factors over which their politicians have increasingly little control in a globalized world, then that's likely to increase political instability, giving politicians less incentive to focus on delivery, and that could ultimately, I think, undermine democracy. So let's think about this question practically by focusing on the UK. Keir Starmer campaigned on a promise to restore trust in government through a two-pronged approach of delivering on Labour's promises and strengthening the ethical standards of his government. This approach is, obviously, predicated on two assumptions: that trust in democratic government is correlated with government performance, and that voters care about the ethical standards of their politicians. What is the evidence for either of these two assumptions? Looking across the Atlantic to Trump's victory in his battle with Kamala Harris casts doubt on both. First, in terms of the assumption that voters care about the ethical standards of their politicians, it's clear that despite court cases, convictions, and scandals, voters were not dissuaded from voting for Donald Trump. Second, in terms of the assumption that voters will reward government delivery, ahead of the US election, pollsters found that despite objective evidence of the strong performance of the US economy as a whole in recent years, a performance due at least in part to the actions of the Biden administration, many voters were dissatisfied with their own economic circumstances. In a 2024 survey by the Associated Press Nork Center for Public Affairs Research, a majority of registered voters described the US economy as poor. This points to the fact that even when a country is doing well in relative terms, growing social and geographical inequality within countries means governments can no longer rely on that to translate into a winning mandate for an election. This also seems to have been a factor in Modi's drop in vote share in India, as I said earlier. But while in other countries, such as the US, it seems voters have not chosen to reward delivery at a national level or politicians who promote high ethical standards, in the UK, the situation looks somewhat different. Most polling and focus group evidence suggests that the Conservative Party lost the election because it had damaged its reputation with voters through a series of ethical scandals and failures in government. That damage was caused, as I think you will all recall, by an exceptional level of party infighting, churning through 5 prime ministers and hundreds of ministers in less than a decade, the Partygate scandal under Boris Johnson, and the crisis caused by the brief premiership of Liz Truss and her disastrous mini-budget. Voters told pollsters that they were also rejecting the Conservatives because of the decline that they had experienced in standards of public services and because of the cost of living crisis. In this context, Starmer's strategy of emphasising Labour's determination to deliver and to raise ethical standards in government seems entirely rational. Nonetheless, most analysis I have seen concludes that while Labour may have succeeded in not scaring off potential voters, not dropping the Ming vase, the party did not so much win the election as the Conservative Party lost it. Polls and focus groups conducted ahead of the election indicated that many voters were simply looking for the best alternative under our first-past-the-post system, whoever was best placed to defeat the Conservative candidate in any constituency. Hence, as I said, the unprecedented diversity of parties in the new House of Commons. Hence also, just as an aside, the unexpected mood I found at Labour and Conservative Party conferences when I attended them this autumn. So we went along to the Conservative Party conference expecting a bit of a wake after a catastrophic loss. Instead, the mood was really rather upbeat in Birmingham, and I think that was because the view was that voters had not been attracted to the Labour Party. Rather, the Conservatives had lost the election. That might seem counterintuitive to you, but I think the view there was really the Conservatives had lost because they had pursued the wrong policies, and you can insert into that a word whatever your personal view is of what wrong was, depending on who you are within the Conservative Party. But the view was because Labour wasn't very attractive to voters, the Conservatives just had to right whatever that wrong was and they could be readily re-elected. Meanwhile, at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, rather than being a celebratory victory party, there was a really rather surprisingly downbeat mood. The vibe was rather, I think, a cold realisation of the responsibilities and challenges of government and the difficulty of delivering in straitened economic circumstances. Which leads us back to the question, what is the relationship between governments delivering for their people and the trust of those people in democracy? And a more specific question for the UK right now, is a government that delivers on its promises and maintains high ethical standards sufficient to increase trust, or are there other factors at play? And I just want to identify, and I'm sure there are many more, but 3 lessons relevant to this question that I think we can take if we look across the elections that have happened across the world this year. Firstly, in our globalised world, governments may often be rewarded or punished for the effect of events or trends which are beyond their control. This year was a particularly difficult one for incumbent governments who were removed from office by voters because the analysis seems to suggest because of the cost of living crisis generated by high inflation caused largely by the impact of the Ukraine war on energy prices. This continues a trend since COVID. Rob Ford of Manchester has talked about the greatest wave of anti-incumbent voting ever seen, with incumbents having been removed from office in 40 of the 54 elections in Western democracies since 2020. Labour cannot avoid the conclusion that while some of the problems they are facing are the result of policy decisions taken by their predecessors, which they can change, many were caused by factors outside the control of any UK politician, and they will be no more able to influence those factors than their predecessors could. For example, Labour's success in achieving its growth mission for the UK to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 will be determined as much by the policies of the 6 other countries as by their own. Was it wise to set an objective so far out of the government's control? Does it risk disillusioning voters about the ability of domestic politicians to deliver on their promises? A second lesson, I think, from this year of elections is that voters vote on the basis of their daily experience, not just the performance of the country as a whole. In this context, Labour's growth mission is important not because voters will notice if the UK has the fastest growing economy in the G7, but because of the cash that achieving that mission would free up for ministers to spend on improving the public services that voters experience on a daily basis, whether they can get an appointment with their GP, progress through an NHS waiting list, or have their children taught by qualified teachers. The challenge for governments is not just changing the public's experience, but also successfully communicating with them to convince them that things have changed. The risk is that the need to deliver for voters in the short term distracts politicians from implementing important reforms over the longer term. Geographical inequality is important when it comes to voter experience, which is why both main parties' commitment to English devolution makes sense. In one of the most overly centralised and geographically unequal countries in the world, a genuine attempt to shift power away from the centre of government and the southeast and to focus decision-making closer to the people it is intended to benefit is an important move forward. At the Institute for Government, we think that the development in England of a new layer of devolved government, a layer of mayoral combined authorities, is one of the most positive developments in our political system in recent years. It's not perfect in many ways. The map is incomplete. Powers and policy responsibilities devolved have been inconsistent, and mayors are still working out when and how to work together and to amplify their collective voice. But genuine devolution has the potential to strengthen UK democracy. And this is a fertile area, I think, where social scientists have much to contribute through their research. A third lesson from this year of elections, and one which troubles me, is that voters are increasingly primed for dissatisfaction with democracy. Now, I say this for 3 reasons. Firstly, because voters' expectations of government have been shifted by the crises that have affected the UK and other countries in recent years, particularly the pandemic and then the energy price shock of the Ukraine war. The way that UK government stepped in during COVID to support individuals' jobs through the enormous furlough scheme, and then to reduce individuals' and businesses' energy bills during the energy crisis, has created unreasonable new expectations about the safety net that government should provide and the scope of government activity. I say unreasonable because of the ratcheting up of national debt that these interventions has entailed, and the political difficulty of bringing down these debt levels through taxation or cuts in government expenditure during a period of high inflation. This has led to the second reason, I think, that I say voters have been primed for dissatisfaction with democracy: the reluctance of politicians to be honest with voters about difficult trade-offs. We saw this from both the main parties ahead of the UK general election, as they assured voters they could improve public services without increasing debt or the main broad-based forms of taxation. And we've seen it in Trump's attractive but mutually inconsistent promises to impose tariffs on imported goods and end inflation. If some political actors are prepared to promise voters they can have their cake and eat it, it makes it harder for the rest to be realistic. And the third way in which I think voters are being primed for dissatisfaction with democracy is in terms of the rapidity of government delivery that voters have come to expect. If the state can create a furlough scheme in a matter of weeks, then why can it not do the same to solve the social care crisis or reduce waiting lists, voters might ask. I think that Labour's missions are an attempt to marshal the resources of the state behind its most important objectives, learning lessons from the government's approach to Brexit and COVID. But there is no substitute for an actual crisis if you really want to cut through the bureaucracy of day-to-day government or mobilise resources. And some problems simply cannot be solved overnight. Government has long struggled to achieve cross-cutting policy objectives, and this is why Labour has laid such an emphasis, I think, on the need for a decade of renewal. But the question is whether voters who have been primed for quick solutions to urgent problems are prepared to wait that long. I think this situation is potentially dangerous for democracy. Voters' expectations of the speed and capacity of government to deliver have been amplified at the same time that the ability of governments to deliver has been reduced by geopolitical circumstances and economic constraints. The danger comes if expectations are elevated by circumstances and rhetoric, and I think social media is obviously an issue here, and if they're elevated to such an extent that voters cannot be anything but disappointed in what governments can actually do for them. If this leaves voters feeling they have no alternative but to sack their political leaders, albeit for failing to deliver unrealistic outcomes for reasons beyond their control, we will be destined to endure endless policy instability. A culture of unrealistic expectations could also ultimately promote dissatisfaction with the institution of democracy itself. This is dangerous if it points voters not towards the question of how to improve the institution and practice of democracy, and instead towards the apparently easier answers of populism and ultimately authoritarian government, as we have seen in countries like Hungary. And the risks of democracy, I think, will be exacerbated if politicians conclude that the rational way to respond is not to double down on delivery by making government better, which is difficult, hard, long-term work, but to stoke dissatisfaction with their opponents and offer apparently easy solutions. To conclude, I think that what this year of elections has illustrated for the UK is that a government that delivers for its citizens is a necessary but not sufficient condition for increasing trust in democracy. Keir Starmer's strategy of focusing on delivery and ethics is a reasonable starting point, but any government would need to do more to shift the dial. If this sounds unduly negative, I want to end on a note of optimism. I think in the UK, at least, we have 3 reasons to feel optimistic that we're not yet seeing the damage to democracy that I've suggested could happen. First, our current party leaders do seem to be making efforts to avoid some of the traps I have identified. Keir Starmer, in his first conference speech as PM, talked explicitly about tough long-term decisions and trade-offs, the need for some people to live near prisons if offenders are to be incarcerated, for overground pylons to reduce the cost of electricity, for every community to contribute to national aspirations for home ownership. Likewise, Kemi Badenoch, in her first speech as leader, talked about telling the truth, planning for the future, and admitting mistakes. We have to hope that these instincts are genuine and sustained throughout the Parliament. Second, my second reason for optimism, at the IFG we feel there is genuine interest from politicians across the political spectrum in the question of how government can be done better. UK politicians, at least, have not yet given up on the aspiration to deliver better, and there is plenty of work to be done to help them fulfil that aspiration. And third, my third reason to be cheerful, we have a strong research community working to provide the evidence we need to help understand and shape the trends we're seeing in our democracy. The extent and quality of this expertise is reflected in the publication, which Bobby was highlighting at the start of this. And I think that it's a really brilliant illustration of the multifaceted expertise which social scientists can bring to bear on the host of policy problems which are facing government. Every country is different, but the UK must continue to learn from experience around the world. There's enormous potential for research to explore what works to increase trust in democracy, including in terms of the themes I've talked about today, focusing on the experience of individual voters, resetting voter expectations of what is possible for governments to achieve, and increasing the ability of governments to deliver. This is important work to which the Institute for Government will continue to make our contribution, and we look forward to learning from and working with social scientists across a range of disciplines as we do so in the coming years. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Hannah. What a run through, and I agree with so much of it. And it does feel like we've been round these loops before in similar sorts of circumstances. Expectations management, communications, making sure people connect outcomes to how they actually feel. We seem to have been there before. Just a couple of observations just before people can start thinking of their questions. Just more from what we know from social science research in different sorts of ways. And that point about not promising on things that are beyond your control is such a key one when you're talking about trust, because that is so often where it's undermined. And just a reflection that Peter Hall's work and colleagues' work on studying manifestos across 21 countries over the past 50 or 60 years shows a really clear move from political promises, moving from economic promises to cultural promises. So this is not just the UK, has been a real shift because the global economic situation makes it so much more difficult for national governments to actually promise anything economic in terms of outcome. But that puts pressure on the cultural promises that political parties and governments are making. And just a second point on that, I've only got three, is so true on trying to disaggregate what actually matters to trust. And I think we do often forget some of the models that we have on this. So that my favourite is the simplest, which is the ABI model of trust. So it's ability, benevolence, and integrity. So ability is delivery, integrity is your point about standards and ethics. But there's a benevolence point in the middle, which is effectively, are you on my side or not? And this is really key, I think, to the dynamics that we've got now in an increasingly polarised country and collection of countries. Whether you feel that the government is on your side or not becomes increasingly difficult to achieve if your side is not in power. And we've done some work on this on the World Value Survey that show it is harder for countries with high levels of polarisation to have high levels of confidence in government. within those when you look across, with the US in a bad position. And that's my final point, which is also reassuring, very much in line with yours, is when we measure support for democracy in principle, we get the highest ratings that we've ever seen. But if you ask people, is democracy a good idea, a good way to run the country, you get the highest proportions, and it's been a big increase in the proportion of people saying it's a very good system to run the government. The problem is delivery, as you so rightly, whether it's working for people, but the idea that in the UK we have a strong authoritarian reflex is very overstated. When we look at the trends on, we should just elect a strong leader who doesn't have to bother about Parliament, it's very flat over time, very different from the US, which has increased over time. And I guess that's my final point, is we are not the US. And it's good to just keep reminding ourselves of that, particularly right now. So we do have that basis, but delivery is so important to it. So just as I scan the any reflections on this?
That's really interesting, thank you. And it's really, really interesting to hear those observations. I guess a question back to you is just based on that first point you made about manifestos. So why do you think Labour made that economic commitment about it wasn't just a sort of any old economic commitment saying fastest growing economy in the G7. That's quite a stretch. So what do you think was behind that?
Well, I mean, I can't tell you the motivations apart from it's probably a key part of what's needed for the very reasons that you're saying, is all of the work, and Torsten's lecture last year or the year before and others showing how low our growth was and how related that is to inequality. It's not, you can't choose one thing or the other. You need growth and lower inequality, I think is a key thing to get people to notice, as you say. So I think it's the right objective, whether it's in power to give. And I always think it is risky to link objectives to trust, because it always feels like it's easier to change perceptions than it is to change these hard factors, but it's actually the opposite, as your lecture made really clear. You've got to get people to notice and connect those things, which adds another layer of challenge to it. Great. Well, I'm going to scan the room for questions. We've got such an expert audience here. It's quite incredible and slightly intimidating. For anyone got comments, questions, reflections? Yes, please. I think we've got a microphone coming. So.
Thank you, Hannah, for a brilliant lecture, and I really agreed on it with all of it. And then I thought there's one issue which I'd be really interested to hear your views on, which is where you see identity politics in this mix. And I find this year very confusing on the identity landscape. You talked about Modi. The US election, I think, challenged a lot of our assumptions that certain groups would vote for Kamala Harris just because of her identity. We've got quite big shifts in some of the identity issues within the UK. Class politics seems on decline, but new emerging identities. So how important do you think identity is in the way that we vote? And how do you think it's changing? And what would you want politicians do in response to that evolution of identity as a factor in how we vote?
Great question. Let me just see if there's any other immediate ones. Here and then here. There's one there and one in.
Thanks. I think the relatively direct answer to the question about trust versus performance, in Pippa Norris's work at least, is that in autocracies there's no relationship, right? And in liberal democracies there is a strong relationship, with the key caveat, which depends on how free your basically your journalism is and your information, which is maybe not that surprising in some ways, but it does open another channel, which is, well, try and do that. I mean, not recommending it, but it does raise the question more generally as to whether we should be much, much more active in a world of social media and so on, be more assertive about actually that is so key to that relationship and the function of our democracies that we're just a bit too relaxed about it.
Sorry, Dave, too relaxed about...
in other words, we should be more assertive about actually you have to make sure that there is a true, reliable source of flows of information, and disinformation you have to, get rid of, as opposed to we're slightly ambivalent, we're a little liberal, well, maybe we shouldn't worry about it,
Yeah, very good. There was a lady there, and then I'll come to Stephen.
Coridon Roberts, thank you very much for your talk. It is a very difficult time, and you've identified some of the, what I find of quite worrying trends and issues. My question really relates to the situation in Britain in terms of what, and I think it slightly picks up your point about what one can do to control a media which is increasingly willing to present terribly distorted information, where even our good TV channels are very reluctant to have real experts on as opposed to journalists. I'm thinking of Newsnight, for example. One hardly ever sees a pucker social scientist on it, and I've argued for long that the Academy should do more in trying to encourage that. But also, where very, very few people have any real practical experience of democracy. With the collapse of the trade unions, which did have features of providing a democratic contrast, a way of showing people how votes could work, even if it was not always perfect, with a sort of emasculation of local government. What we really have is, I think, a big democratic deficit. We don't actually educate our children in schools properly. It's always seen as too controversial, even to tell them how the system really works. So the sort of education I got at school, I never hear a child getting that sort of education now. They don't know how government works. They don't know about Parliament. They don't know about the difficulties of making decisions over a complex society. So those are the areas I wish we could do more about. Your thoughts on that would be helpful.
I'm going to stop with those and then come back to you, Stephen, after the next round. Hannah.
Great questions. Okay, so starting with identity politics, I think you're absolutely right. That was a omission from what I was talking about, but it's certainly not an omission from our politics. Maybe a bit more evident in some other countries, but certainly a growing trend for politicians to sort of start to wade into cultural wars, if you want to put it that way. And interested in that research that you were mentioning, Bobby, which talks about the kind of things which are maybe pushing them that way, away from economics and towards identity politics. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, the point you raise about, what was expected by polling companies and people doing focus groups and things in the US in terms of how voters were going to vote. And we seem to have endless discussions ahead of elections these days about sort of whether there are shy X or Y, insert your people who aren't willing to say that they're going to vote a certain way, and that seems to be a real challenge for polling companies who, they choose to say, for example, assume that lots of women are going to vote for Kamala Harris, and then actually, that doesn't prove to be the case, and so the reliability of those polls, which actually have the potential to sort of shape democracy as well as informing us about what might be going to happen, is a big sort of issue for us as well. So, what should politicians do? I mean, I think it is the case that in society, identity issues are a much bigger thing than they used to do. So obviously politicians can't necessarily ignore those things. But I mean, the very simple, obvious answer is not weaponize them and seek to increase division by pitting different groups in society against each other, which could be, it does feel as though Donald sort of some of the ways in which Donald Trump has, as an example, sort of campaigned are designed to create division and to do so in order to drive sort of electoral advantage. In terms of David's question on sort of the quality of the media, yeah, I think I probably agree with you. I think possibly we are a bit too relaxed about these things. There are obviously great outfits, sort of fact-checking people like Full Fact and sort of BBC Verify and so on, who do their best in terms of these things. And I think I was, there were some instances in the election this time round of sort of fact-checking of debates in real time, and some efforts by sort of newspapers and people to sort of to fact-check some claims in interviews and so on, which I thought was sort of a good development. But yeah, I don't think we can. Obviously, social media is difficult from a regulation point of view. I have been somewhat heartened by the massive increase in number of people who seem to be on Blue Sky rather than X since the US election. Although I'm maintaining my X account to make sure I'm getting every side of the picture. But yeah, that's a another sort of new challenge emerging. And then lots of interesting parts to your question. I hopefully cover them all. I mean, how to encourage the media to have more sort of experts on the media. Obviously, that's something I would endorse from the Institute for Government. I think that partly it's about the incentives on academics, because, I mean, I do a lot of work on Parliament, and there's a problem in Parliament about who parliamentary committees call to give evidence to them as well. And often it can be the sort of same people who always get called. And partly that's because the set of experts who have the sort of time, willingness, expertise and ability to talk in plain English to MPs is smaller than the subset of people with real expertise upon whom committees could call. And I think it's really difficult for academics to feel that appearing on Newsnight to talk about their research is necessarily going to advance them in their academic careers. And so that can be, promoting the sort of public voice of academics and making sure that in their careers there's some form of sort of feedback and benefit in doing that, and then they're not penalised because then they haven't sort of written as many articles or books or whatever it is, I think is one aspect of it. In terms of the democratic deficit, as someone with 3 small children at school, I completely agree. I mean, the stuff that they're taught about at school, we've just had an election and you would barely know it from, the kind of what they are taught about at school. I think, the improving civic education clearly can be done because other countries do it much better. I know there have been lots of worthy attempts to do it here, and I wouldn't claim to be expert on why those don't seem to have borne fruit. As you say, it used to be better, it appears, but so I think that's definitely something I'd endorse, but I'm not quite sure how we get there. And the only other thing which sort of links the two parts of your question, I think, is one of the things I'm really worried about, and something that we're considering a project at the Institute on the relationship between the media and policy making, but is the decline of local media in terms of people knowing what's going on in their local area. I have a very sort of probably naive hope that the sort of advent of mayors might sort of encourage people to have more interest in sort of politics, that there might be some kind of rejuvenation around reporting of what's going on politically locally with the sort of more high-profile mayoral model. But really, the funding, I think, is the issue, and so that's another problem. Sorry.
Very good. So we did have Stephen, and then there's one there and one there. Great.
Yeah, no, fantastic lecture and lots of food for thought. I wanted to sort of really ask some questions about institutions, really, in two contexts. First of all, I just wanted to say that I think the growth mission is perfectly fine. It carries the necessary level of ambition. And indeed, given the depth of the problem we face across so many areas of public policy, we need boldness. So my first sort of question, or my first institutional question, is about how do we create the conditions for the bold reforms that are really needed to deliver what the public wants? So I could give 3 examples. One is planning reform, whether excellent start by the government, but arguably we need to go much further. I'm afraid I really am a planning system liberaliser. Second one is tax reform. So, barely a week goes by without Paul Johnson saying we must get rid of council tax, business rates and stamp duty. These are incredibly bad taxes, yet they go on. How can we create the conditions in which they can be reformed? And then the other one is public service reform. So I think the budget put £22 billion extra into the NHS. How's that consistent with, say, the IFG's work on a greater emphasis on preventative spend? Right? Could we not have kept back 10 billion for preventative public health, for example? So the institutional question then is, how can we do better? Years ago, the IFG did this report on 7 policy successes, and it highlighted, for example, the great job that Adair Turner did with the Pension Commission, before which people said, it's impossible to reform the pension system, yet we did. Second, so how can we create more institutions like the Pension Commission to do that, to address fundamental issues? The other one is, in terms of institutional gaps, it relates to the commitment to more public investment. Now, absolutely we need to invest more as a country, though there are questions around whether we should focus so narrowly on physical capital as opposed to human and social. But we face lots of barriers in the system. So, for example, we announce new investments before we appraise them. We have a culture which says if you get a benefit cost ratio of 0.5, you fail to monetise all the benefits, rather than maybe this is not a good thing to do. We're also incredibly risk averse. So we end up providing support for projects that would have happened anyway without government being involved. And in that context, I'm very worried by the new financial transaction control framework, which a few geeks might have looked at. Question then is, how can we create new institutions consistent with, the electorate deciding what's done, that enables us to really make sure that if we invest more, that we invest in quality projects, that we get good economic and social returns. If you look back to the post-war period of the 50s and 60s, levels of public investment in this country were much higher, but the quality was very poor. We invested in lots of duff activities. Why was public investment slashed in the 1970s? Why were the nationalised industries privatised? Because their performance was so poor. Look back at some of the academic reports at the time by people like Richard Pryke at Liverpool University in the 70s and 80s. So there's something about how do we create institutional arrangements that can support better outcomes. Now, we've got some great successes, I'm a great fan personally of the OBR. I hope that the new, for example, Office for Value for Money lives up to my expectations. I don't know whether it will. But what else should we be doing to enable the right things to happen?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen. Then we got one here.
I have, I hope, a somewhat shorter question. One theme of the Labour government, which is of interest to me as a public lawyer, is that it accepts limitations on government power in various ways. One is emphasis on the rule of law, on complying with international law, on maintaining the Human Rights Act. One, which you touched on, Hannah, in your talk, is about devolution, and which means both accepting the devolution settlements in relation to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also real devolution within England. And the consequence of real devolution is that the answer to central government is that central government will have less power. And my question is there an issue of getting a public that I think still sometimes thinks in a sort of traditional English way that I think English advisedly, that central government should and can do absolutely everything? How do you educate a public into accepting that government should not do everything, and both cannot do everything and should not do everything, that there are real good reasons for those limitations on its powers?
Very good. Great, thank you. And there was one behind. And I might actually take one more and then call it on on the questions, and we can talk more over reception. So yes, please.
Thanks. I wanted to push back a little bit, Hannah, on your liking for the new mayors and mayoral combined authorities. I think the picture's a very mixed one at the moment about whether or not that model is actually going to be successful. And I think one of the things that makes me wonder about it is that if you look at the way that local government has gone over the past 10 to 15 years, it's increasingly got bigger in terms of institutions. So that the move to unitarisation, for instance, inevitably means fewer districts. Well, you can argue about whether somebody once described them as pathetic little districts are worth it, but nevertheless they are more remote from actual citizens. Then if you combine that with looking at the way that the accuracy and completeness of the electoral registers is declining, and that governments haven't wanted to do anything about that, and the level of democratic disengagement, there are some structural things about the actual framework of how we hold elections that need to be looked at, I think, really carefully in a quite objective and hopefully apolitical kind of way to be sorted as well.
Very good. And yes, I'll take this as the last one, but there will be plenty of time to chat over reception.
Thanks. At the Labour Party conference, I was asked on air, is this the end for Keir Starmer? Might we be, and when I say we, interpret this as you will, might we be addicted to the turmoil, the churn, and the chaos of the last 10 years?
The perfect final question.
Maybe pollsters are.
Thank you very much. Wow, what a brilliant set of questions. Good luck,
Okay.
Hannah.
I'll try and cover all the elements of your question, Stephen. So I very much agree that this institutions question is an interesting one. I know Jeff Mulgan's doing some thinking about this kind of institutions, like modern institutions, and what the institutions are that we need and how we create them. And I agree that we have some good examples of ones which have added value. We also have examples of ones which have been less successful. And so I think one of the important things is about killing off the ones that don't add value and retaining the ones that do, making it difficult for the ones that do, even if they make life harder for government, making it difficult for them to be dismantled once they've proven their worth. I also agree with you in terms of this question of boldness. It feels like the extent of some of the problems we have do mean that we need some bold answers. And I think that we need to think about what the sort of incentives and constraints are on politicians in terms of coming up with those bold answers. If you sort of think about the sort of manifestos on which the two parties campaigned, the extent to which they dared to sort of differ from each other on a whole host of things was really quite limited. When it doesn't feel as though the UK public, albeit the sort of personalities are put to the forefront, it doesn't feel like there's a sort of a big choice that was being offered in the way that, if you look back to some previous more historic elections, that was the case. And so there certainly seems to be a sense from parties that sort of boldness is dangerous, and that, if you come up with your, for example, plan on social care reform in the heat of an election campaign, that you're highly likely to be punished for that. And then if you don't, then you don't have the mandate from the public, and you can be subject to the sort of criticism, which I think already the government's ratings have dropped in the Joe can confirm the polling in terms of like people saying things are happening which we didn't anticipate in terms of some of the things that happened in the budget and so on. This wasn't sort of signalled ahead of the election, and then that is a reason to sort of beat governments over the head. So they sort of are between a rock and a hard place, in the sense of, if you're bold, you potentially get the negative effect of that. If you're not bold, then when you come into government, you don't have the mandate to do these things. Another thought on this is I do think one of the issues is about policy making in opposition. So some of the most successful, some successful things which have been done by governments in the past have relied on a lot of thinking having happened and policy development having happened in opposition. But I fear that if you haven't had the time and the resource to do that thinking, that then once you get into government, it's you need to be bold quickly at the start of your term when you've got your mandate. But if you've got to do the sensible thing, which is consult and set up reviews and things, because you haven't done your thinking, potentially you can lose momentum, and you're halfway through the Parliament by the time you've got your ideas, and by that point they're harder to implement. So I do think there's something around how we resource opposition to policy development, and whether that should just be up to the strength of the social sort of civil society, which happens to support any given political party, or whether there's any other sort of way in which we ought to support opposition policy making. George's question on how to educate the public or talk to the public about sort of who does what, I think that's an interesting one. I mean, I think also linking to the third question, it's there's some potential for people to be encouraged by the mayoral model. I think I was searching for the reference for this lecture, and I couldn't find it, so I didn't put it in. But I've certainly read something that said that more people can in mayoral areas that are more established can identify their mayor than can identify their MP, and the sense that you've got someone locally who's sort of championing the cause of your local area, I think, is potentially something quite powerful. So potentially that's something to kind of build on, making people sort of feel that actually this is someone closer to the geography in which I live, who actually would like to be making decisions on whatever it is, rather than someone who's more remote in Whitehall. Of course, the question is, how close do you need to be able to make those decisions? And I guess there's different answers depending on what the policy is that you're pursuing. And some things are best done at different geographies, and I think it's going to be a question of sort of experimentation a bit. We can learn lots of lessons from elsewhere about sort of what works at what level. Not everything will work at a mayoral level, and you're right, there are some things which are better done at a smaller geography. But I think I know the government has plans to sort of look at local government sort of rationalisation, or whatever the term is. It's obviously an enormous task. But yeah, I retain my optimism. It's nice to have something to be optimistic about. I agree that the model is very variable. There's obviously going to be a big difference between the metropolitan mayors and the others, which we're starting to see come through now that the big sort of obvious mayoralties have been sort of picked off. I was talking to Claire Ward about this the other day, who's again, I shouldn't have started this sentence without remembering which her mayoralty is, but she was saying, she's basically got 3 large-ish towns rather than one big metropolitan centre in her mayoralty, and it's just quite a different thing for her, and the powers and the task that she has. I failed to write down Joe's question. It was so good. What was it?
Are we addicted to chaos?
Oh, we're addicted to chaos. You may be addicted to chaos. No, I think this is it is a big issue that particularly the media likes personalities, likes intrigue, and so those are the sorts of, often when the government is going somewhere to try to announce a worthy sort of policy initiative, it's the lobby journalists that will accompany the PM and the Secretary of State, and it's not a journalist with kind of real expertise, and so the coverage then becomes about the sort of the person and the sort of whether they're on the up or on the down and that sort of thing, rather than the substance of the policy. So I think there is something about the way our media is structured, which isn't ideal in terms of cultivating a sort of a focus on intrigue and chaos. I have to say, after sort of Brexit was sort of coming to a close, one of my friends said to me, "Oh, it's going to be really dull at the RFG now, isn't it?" Has not proven to be the case. So yeah, I think for people who are interested in good government, there's always lots going on. But I think in terms of what we, one of the things we definitely would relish at the RFG is a bit more stability and consistency in terms of government and therefore policy. Whether or not you agree with the policies of a given government, giving them a shot at delivering them and seeing how they work out is probably better than constantly chopping and changing.
Great. A perfect note to end on, and exactly on 7:15, which is where we're supposed to end. Perfect. Real professional ending. So that is it for this bit. Just a couple of notices from me, just reminders really that the recording for this event will be available afterwards if you want to re-watch it or pass it on to other people. And then just to point you towards some brilliant websites, Campaign for Social Science websites, we've got lots of material on there, SAGE's website, and of course IFG's amazing website. And we're going to move to the reception in a minute, where Sage have got lots of free books for us as well, apparently outside. So a real treat tonight. So it's just for me to give thanks, first of all, to you for coming out on a rainy Monday. It was an incredible audience, incredible questions. Thank you for that. To thank you to Katie and Sage for sponsoring the event and their amazing ongoing support for the campaign more generally. To the team, Steve and Amy and many others for putting this together. But then finally, and most importantly, to Hannah for an amazing lecture. Thank you so much, Hannah.